This is a Culture Inject production. The Nevers Podcast presents In Conversation With.
Tim Lebbon is a British horror and dark fantasy writer and New York Times bestselling author. Tim's short story, Reconstructing Amy, won the Bram Stoker Award for short fiction, and his novel Dusk won the 2007 August Derleth Award from the British Fantasy Society for Best Novel of the Year. Tim's novelization of the film 30 Days of Night became a New York Times bestseller and won a Scribe Award in 2008. Tim's more recent works include Star Wars, Dawn of the Jedi, Into the Void, the Rage War Trilogy, Kong Skull Island, and Joss Whedon and Drew Goddard's The Cabin in the Woods. Tim's novel Firefly Generations is the latest in a series of original novel tie-ins of the much-missed Firefly series. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So I guess we'll get started just by asking, what got you into writing and what particularly got you into horror and dark fantasy?
Right. Well, there's short answers and long answers to those, so I'll do a shorter version. What got me into writing? I've always loved storytelling. I've always loved reading. My mum got me into reading when I was really young. So when I was 8 or 9, I was reading a book a day. And I started writing stories probably in my pre-teens when I was 12 or 13, maybe a bit younger. So I've always written all through my teens. I was writing. I was sort of copying all sorts of writers. I started countless novels in my teens, but never finished any of them. None of them exist anymore, unfortunately. I sort of wish I had those exercise books filled with my first attempts, but they've gone somewhere. As for horror, I honestly don't know. And another thing, my nan had a saying, and my mum as well. It's the way your mum put your hat on. So sometimes you just can't track or trace why you're sort of drawn towards a certain genre of fiction, for instance, or a certain sport. It's just the way your mum put your hat on. So I've always written horror and always read it and always enjoyed it. There's very little I've written, very, very little that doesn't contain any sort of fantastical element. 2 novels I've written, which are straight thrillers, but even they're really, 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 really dark. But everything I write, novel 47, I think I'm on now, which is pretty staggering, really. Pretty much everything contains a fantastical element and edges more towards the dark side. I've written some alternate world fantasy novels, for 5 or 6 of those, but they've been described variously as horror novels set in a fantasy world. So pretty dark and grim, really. It's not reflected in my personality, I don't think. But then if I didn't write horror, I don't dread to think what I'd be like.
And who are some of the authors whose work you enjoy reading?
Oh, many. God blimey. So, an author that got me into horror, I always say, was James Herbert, and his novel The Rats got me into horror. When I was, my mum gave me that to read when I was maybe 11, probably a bit young to be reading that sort of stuff. But so at the time I jumped from reading Hardy Boys novels to reading James Herbert and Stephen King and didn't really look back. I didn't go through my teens. I didn't sort of go back to reading younger person's novels during my teens. I just hit the horror shelves. Stephen King is still a firm favourite of mine now. He's one of the few authors who I'll drop another book to pick up his new novel and read. I think he's still amazing. He's a massive influence on me from a younger age, and that continues now. Other writers like my great old friend Graham Joyce, bless him, who passed away a few years ago. He was a fantastic writer, and I keep mourning the idea that there's no more new Joyce books. Similarly, Ian Banks, he was a firm favourite of mine. And newer writers like, my peers, people like Alison Littlewood and Paul Malloy, Paul Tremblay. There's just so many to mention, fearing that I'll miss some out. But yeah, I'm inspired by everything I read, whether in a positive way or negative way sometimes.
That's a good way to look at it. So you're always taking something away, whether you enjoyed it or not.
Yeah, I love picking up a book and reading it and being so blown away by it that I think, why the hell do I bother? But that's a learning experience, and I'm very comfortable with the idea that I'm at a certain level of my writing career and skill set. There are many writers far better than me. But I also occasionally pick up a book and think, oh, well, that was all right. But I could probably have told that story in a maybe more entertaining way. So I think it's quite healthy to understand your place in the sort of, what am I trying to say? Not the levels of writing, but understand your capabilities and your, how far you're getting in your career and how, I'm not saying how good you are. I try and improve with every novel I write. That doesn't always happen. I have personal favorites of mine out of my books, and sometimes it's not always the current one I'm working on, unfortunately, but that's just the way it goes sometimes.
So moving on to Firefly, were you a watcher of Firefly when it first aired on TV?
Not when it first aired, so I caught up with it subsequent to its first airing and watched the series and really enjoyed it. And that was quite a while ago. And then Titan approached me to write a novel. So I needed to do a rewatch, which I did on my, I'm a keen cyclist and triathlete. So I got my static bike set up in the living room and spent the day watching. I sat on my bike for 4 hours and watched several episodes of Firefly and started catching up with it. And it was great to go back to it and rediscover the universe, the verse.
You mentioned there that, Titan approached you, but
yeah.
What was the full chain of events that kind of led you to finally writing Firefly Generations? Well,
I'd written quite a few tie-in novels before that. I think my first tie-in novel was either a Hellboy novel or original novel, or I also did the novelization of Cabin in the Woods, another Joss Whedon project, which took ages to be published because I think Cabin in the Woods was tied up in some studio going through or something. I can't remember the specifics. So I'd done a few tie-in novels, some for other publishers, but I'd also done several for Titan. Done an Alien novel, and Cabin in the Woods was for Titan, and I did the Rage War trilogy, Alien Predator trilogy as well. So I had a good relationship. I still have a good relationship with Titan, and the editor there, Kat Camacho, approached me to ask if I fancied doing a Firefly, because I think James Lovegrove had written several by them, 2 or 3 at least. And obviously I said yes. So I get offered a fair bit of tie-in work, and I never say yes to something that I don't think I really enjoy doing. I've been offered a few that I think, I'm not sure that's really my thing. But yeah, I jumped at this, and it's such a great, rich. I think the fact that it's finished makes it more attractive to writers like me. The Alien Predator thing is still ongoing. There's still Alien movies coming out and Predator movies. So it's a bit more difficult plonking yourself into the timeline and into the canon. But with Firefly, it's sort of done and dusted, although we all, there's always the hope that maybe it'll be resurrected in some form, which would be strange with the actors now. But, there's talk of all sorts of possibilities. Animated series, I think they were talking about recently, weren't they?
Yeah, we're always hoping for more and more. But like I say, it's nice that you've got kind of like this finite amount of stuff at the minute. Yeah. So that kind of leads me into my next question of what the process is developing the story, because, it has to be something original to pique the reader's interest and the editors. But, did you spend a lot of time considering story ideas, or did they kind of come to you relatively quickly?
So Titan asked me for several ideas, which I then, they asked me basically 4 sort of novel ideas, and I gave them a paragraph each, 4 paragraphs. And Generations was one of them. And I sort of, it was one of my favorites at the time. Another one of my favorites involved Niska, the ultra gangster, and the team trying to break him out of a prison, which I thought would be great fun. But I'll keep that up my sleeve. But yeah, Generations was the one that they went for, and I think it probably, some of the other tie-in stuff I've done, like the Rage War trilogy, is a real action fest, and Generations sort of aired that way as well in some ways. I like the idea of putting the crew into a sort of war mentality in a way. So Titan chose that paragraph and asked me to write a proposal. So I worked on it some more and worked it into a sort of a novel proposal, and they okayed that and sent me away to write it. And that was the end of the beginning, but not the beginning of the end even, because I wrote the novel, and then there was a really heavy editorial process on the novel after I finished writing it, just to make sure I got dotted the I's and crossed the T's when it came to characterization and voice and canon, keeping in the timeline. I couldn't blow up planets that might be used in future comics and things like that. Although I didn't blow up any planets, which isn't a spoiler, really.
So not a spoiler, but can you just give our listeners kind of an idea of the narrative of Firefly Generations?
Yes. So I'm actually fascinated with the idea of generation ships and arc ships. I have written a couple of other stories based on that idea. I wrote a novella called Rime, which was a take of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner in space. And that involved a sort of a generation ship. So for me, one of the most intriguing aspects of Firefly is the idea that it's us in the future. It's humanity in the future in another set of star systems. How far from here, we're not really sure. So Earth That Was is referred to a fair bit in the series. And I thought it would be quite interesting to try and find out a bit more, get some more hints about why we fled Earth That Was and how. So in Generations, it refers to a generation ship. So the crew, Mal wins a star chart in a game of cards, which leads the crew to one of the old arcs that came from Earth That Was and brought humanity to the verse, which is still, it's sort of mythical, really. I like the idea of the mythical history in Firefly as well. There are Earth That Was sort of remnants, people deal in old antiques, as it were. But I like the idea of finding one of the actual ships that did it. So the crew go to find the ship with the idea of salvage, but it turns out that it's not an abandoned ship. It's been placed in orbit around a sort of a remote moon, remote planet, and the Alliance have their hands in it as well.
Yeah, no, that's a nice teaser amount for listeners to hopefully want to go ahead and read this. Yeah, read Firefly Generations. So you mentioned that there was quite a heavy editorial process because these are already established characters. Did you find it easy initially writing these characters?
I like to think I got into the flow of it quite easily. I really like all the characters. I should say that Inara and Book don't play a big part in the book because they're absent from the adventures. So listeners probably need to know that. But all the other characters, they're so distinctive in the series. It's one of some series with ensemble casts, you sort of get confused sometimes about who's who. But in Firefly, they're all so distinctive. They all got their own real distinctive personalities and quirks and habits and peccadillos, So I enjoyed getting into that. And there's some characters I sort of concentrated on more than others, I guess. I really like Jane. I tried to give Jane a bit more, I suppose, in my first drafts, I tried to give him a bit more empathy and humanity, but I sort of had to draw back on that a little bit because, my editor said, no, he really is a bit of an arse. So don't make him too likable. He's a bit of a bumbling buffoon in some ways, quite threatening, but I see him as, I don't know, there's more to Jane. And I think we'd have found out more about Jane if the series had continued, I think. I'm sure Joss Whedon had ideas for all the characters, wheedling out their part.
Yeah.
I enjoyed doing it. I did have to, like I say, in the editorial process, I had to tweak some of the language and some of the characterization, I think. Had to get my head around the quirky language they use some more Mandarin phrases, for instance. But luckily, Titan sent me the encyclopedia of the Firefly, so there's a whole list of Mandarin phrases in there. So I made sure I incorporated some of the great Mandarin swearing, which is great fun.
So, which character, you said that Jane's your favourite? Well, Jane's my favourite character in Firefly, but what was there a character that you found particularly challenging to write?
Yeah, so I think the novel sort of concentrates on River in many respects. The spine of the novel involves River and her past, without giving away too much to the listeners, and she's the most mysterious character in the series, I think. So I found it not difficult getting into her. Well, her mind's a pretty strange place anyway, but not difficult getting into her mind. But I was trying to be quite careful not to develop her character too much away from the away from Firefly canon, really. So I found it quite difficult writing River. Like I say, especially as she's the sort of focus in many respects. She's her relationship with someone they find on the ship is the focus of the novel, really. But she's always intrigued me a lot. She's a pretty cool character, I think, and the fact that she acts, she's sort of confused and a bit woo-woo, and then she can take out 4 guys in 3 seconds, is pretty cool, really. So I enjoyed writing River.
Yeah, she's pretty awesome. Pretty interesting character. My next question is, was there a character you enjoyed writing most? So was that Jane, because you can kind of get away with saying a lot of stuff? Or?
I think so. I quite like Jane. But also Kaylee, Kaylee's fun. I liked that. So there's a part in the novel where Kaylee and Jane are alone for a while. And I really love the dynamic between them. Kaylee's so honest and nice and decent. And Jane, on the surface, is sort of totally the opposite. It's like 2 opposite sides of the same character almost fighting each other. But yeah, I think I enjoyed Jane the most writing him, because you always enjoy, as a writer, I sort of enjoy writing characters who are, have dark side and light side, different depths, So he was fun.
So the voice acting done by James Anderson Foster for the audiobook is excellent. Do you get any say in who narrates your books?
No, not very often, and especially not for tie-in projects. I think that's sort of way out of my hands. My own original novels, I'm usually sent like sample readings from narrators. But even something like the first Alien novel I did for Titan was turned into a fantastic audio dramatization by Dirk Maggs, the legendary Dirk Maggs. It had Rutger Hauer in it and all that, and I didn't, I love hearing from people who say how much they love it. But to be honest, I didn't have an awful lot to do with it. Dirk did the adaptations and obviously the casting and all that was out of my hands. And I don't mind that. It's good to hear somebody else's take on what I've written. And sometimes you hear stuff in there that, oh, blimey, did I write that? I'm not sure that's what I meant, but it's good,
So we kind of touched on this already, but, how did you approach these stories where you have an established world and characters, but, you're a creator who wants to create, as much of your own story as possible? Were you able to do whatever you want, or were you given prompts? So you said they asked you to kind of pitch a few stories, but did they give you any pointers as to things that they might want to see, or it was kind of completely up to you?
Honestly, I think at the time it was just pitches a few ideas. And there are obviously limits to what you can do. And also, so my novel's based between Firefly and Serenity. So because of the timeline and because of canon, there's limits to what you can do and who you can kill, obviously. I can't wipe out the entire crew in a great climax battle, because that just wouldn't work. But most tie-in stuff I've done, like I did a Star Wars novel, and that was similarly left up to me, unless my ideas intruded on stuff they were working on elsewhere. But my Star Wars novel was 25,000 years before A New Hope. So it was literally the earliest novel in the Star Wars timeline, which is great because it meant I didn't have to read 150 other novels to make sure I fitted in the timeline well. But publishers tend to give you as much free reign as possible, whilst ensuring you don't mess things up for the timeline, and they have to ensure canon. Kat at Titan was particularly good at making sure I didn't write somebody out of character for no apparent reason, or mess up. Like there are Hands of Blue in the novel, for instance, and she made sure I was pretty careful about how I wrote them so that it didn't detract from people's memories of them in the series, for instance. But yeah, pretty much free reign on the story. Characters have their own limitations, but it's quite nice to try and get into their heads and figure out, what makes them tick a little bit more than you maybe see in the series.
So you kind of just talked about this already, but basically we know of a writer contracted to write for an established IP, and there was kind of this brand Bible and things that they couldn't change. So, what was the working relationship like with Fox and Titan? And did you have to work with a brand Bible? I know you just mentioned that you have someone who kind of says, you can do this, you can't do that.
So I didn't deal with Fox directly on this. I did when I was doing Alien books. But with this, I was dealing straight with Titan, and they were going to Fox for approvals, which I think they only did twice. I think they got the original story approved from Fox and said, "Yep, go ahead." And then when the novel was finished and edited, I think they sent that to Fox for approval. So yeah, it was Cat Camacho, and a couple of other guys at Titan had a hand in sort of steering the project after I'd written it. But they did send me a load of. I got the Firefly encyclopedia, got 2 or 3 other Firefly books here. That was the encyclopedia, especially, was priceless. I probably couldn't have done it without that, or I could have, but it would have meant watching the series like 15 times to get references. But the encyclopedia, for instance, has got almost a map of the verse, laying out the stars and the planets and the moons, and loads of weapon, even stuff like weaponry. You know, Jane does love his guns, but I had to make sure that he used in the same way as he does in the series, for instance. So the encyclopedia was the Bible, really, and it was really priceless for me using that, writing the book. And then Kat's input at the end was brilliant. Her editorial. Kat's a big Firefly fan, obviously, and she's really sharp on picking up stuff that I might have done wrong. So yeah, that was great.
So was there anything that you wanted to write that Fox or Disney wouldn't allow, or did pretty much everything you sent initially get, the okay?
I think it was all okay, really. Other than what I've mentioned about the editorial tweaks. The one thing I didn't do in my first draft, which Titan tried to encourage, was looking at more the history of Earth that was and how that fed into the verse. So I had to go back in and sort of think up some more examples of what might be on the Sun Tzu, the name of the generation ship. That might have been brought from Earth that was. So that was quite interesting doing that. But I don't think there was anything that Fox read and thought, whoa, that can't happen, And that's Titan's job to make sure, and it worked well, to make sure that what I'd written was approved. And I'm pretty sure it was approved without comment without any changes from Fox eventually, after a couple of edits.
The stories that you've written are now considered canon. Does that make you feel like good and proud to kind of be part of this universe, or does it stress you out a little bit?
No, it's great. I love it. It's I'm pretty sure the Alien novels I've written are canon as well, but I don't know how that changes when it comes to Ridley Scott making new movies. Yeah, it's great. It's nice. It does open you up to. I'm not as big a Firefly fan as a lot of the readers. And I'll say the same about the Star Wars novel I've written. Some of the readers, some of the reviews mention stuff. I think, whoa, I wouldn't even have thought of that. The way Jane said something on page 42, he wouldn't have said it like that. So really, I don't know. So it opens you up to serious fans' analysis, but that's fine. I know that going in. The Star Wars novel was interesting because that was canon when I wrote it, and now it's not. It's Star Wars Legends because Disney. But then, but that's fine. I was hoping to write a trilogy, and I think if Disney hadn't given George Lucas $4 billion, I might have been able to write a trilogy. But I'm not complaining. That's okay.
I like that though, because Disney.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of I think the fact that Disney took over Star Wars so far has been great. We've especially the series Mandalorian, I thought was just a stunning bit of work. And it's just nice for seeing, we saw Rogue One and things like that, which is such a great film.
So was there a scene that you particularly enjoyed writing, like a favourite part of the book?
I like the sort of again, trying not to give too much away, but there's a bit of a sort of a battle on the ship towards the end, and I like writing battle scenes in space. I don't know why that's a very particular thing, but I quite enjoy it, and I did it on my the Alien and Predator trilogy. It's just a wide ranging. It's a far distant war in space, and I had so much fun doing that. So I did it on a smaller scale in Generations. And I like the sort of confusion of battle and failing communications and the team being split up, not knowing what's happened to other members. Like, Wash and Zoe, for instance, not really knowing what's going on with each other. Wash suffers a bit in my book, bless him. So I enjoy writing the battle scenes, but I really enjoyed writing Kaylee and Jane being off together. Like I mentioned before, I enjoyed their interaction between those two characters, especially when they're under threat and they're sort of trying to help each other. You sort of see a slightly more heroic side of Jane there, I think. I think that was left in.
I can say it is a long process. So I guess once you're, you don't really go back and reread everything that you've written, or it take up a large portion of your life, wouldn't it?
Well, during the editorial process, I probably read I don't know how many times I read the book, probably, during the editorial process, another 3 or 4 times I went through completely. And then there's often you dip in and out of sections to tweak stuff here and there. It's very, I don't think I've ever received a box of my books and opened it and read it. The last time I read it is the line edit, really. I'm sick of it by then. I've read it hundreds of times. God. Yeah. After
that, it's just for the fans to enjoy.
Yeah, it's on the shelf. I've got my ego shelf, as most writers. But it's a lovely looking book. I mean, Titan did a great job with the Firefly novels. They all look gorgeous. Distressed covers, and yeah, it looks great. It looks like an artifact from the verse, the Firefly novel. I think you can sort of think, oh, that's been on a desert planet for a year or two.
So I think we touched on this at the beginning, but you consider yourself, a horror and dark fantasy writer. What is it particularly about these genres that appeals to you so much? Because, I guess you enjoyed reading them when you was young, and now do you enjoy writing them, or do you also enjoy writing, is it the thing you enjoy most?
I guess, like I said earlier, I try not to analyze that too much, but then most of what I write tends to turn into a horror or dark fantasy novel. I have written 2 thrillers, and I love writing thrillers, and I'm trying to write a sort of thriller screenplay at the moment, based on one of my novels. Yeah, it's just the way my mind goes. So I'm writing a new novel at the moment, and I'm about halfway through, and I was trying to write it in my head. It's a thriller with supernatural undertones, and I sent my agent the first couple of chapters, a few chapters, and he read it and loved it and said, "Oh, Tim, it's a horror novel." I said, "No, it's not. It's a thriller with possible supernatural undertones." He said, "It's really, really dark. It's a horror novel, but that'll come out in." When I finish it and tweak it and send it back to him and say, "Here's my new thriller. What do you think?" Subtle suggestion. But yeah, my mind just airs that way. But I do love thrillers. Some of my favorite movies. I watch horror movies, but I also really enjoy stuff. I mean, I'm a big John Wick fan. But I think John Wick's a fantasy movie in many respects. It's a ridiculous action movie, but it's also the world building in the John Wick films is brilliant. It's really great world building. And people say it's not a fantasy. I said, well, where are the police? They're having these car chases and people getting shot and blown up and stabbed. And then you see one cop knock on his door, and that's it. So it's I love the world building in those films, and I love. I'm so looking forward to 4 and 5. And Continental, the series.
I was going to say they're making a series, yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be so good. Yeah.
You mentioned the Rage trilogy earlier. So you wrote the Rage War trilogy. It's a trilogy consisting of Predator Incursion, Alien Invasion, and Alien vs. Predator Armageddon, which collectively forms one continuous storyline. They're great. As a horror writer, it must have been a dream come true for you.
Yeah. I've done quite a few tie-in books, and my dream project was always an Alien novel, and I almost did it 15 years ago for Dark Horse, and then the editor left. They'd done a few Alien novels, and then I wrote Alien Out of the Shadows for Titan, which is part of a very, very, very loose trilogy of books with Chris Golden and Jim Moore writing the other 2. And that was an absolute dream project, Out of the Shadows, because I also got to write a Ripley story. And then leading on from that did pretty well, I think. Out of the Shadows, the dramatization, which I talked about earlier, did really well. It was sold in like a dozen countries around the world, and it did really good business, So Titan wanted to do, they obviously got the rights to do Alien and Predator and Alien versus Predator. So they asked me to write a trilogy. And again, I was given pretty much free rein. The editor there just said, we want something which is sort of quite far distant, far future, sort of a space war story, not too contained, but quite wide ranging. And that's pretty much all he gave me. And I came up with the sort of story idea myself, and huge cast of characters. And the only sort of restrictions on that was one novel had to be Alien, one had to be Predator, and one had to be Alien versus Predator, which is difficult because the whole story is xenomorphs and predators, fighting throughout the universe, and humans involved, and a bad bunch of humans as well. So I was given a sort of it was like the first one was Predator Incursion. I think, yeah, it was Predator Incursion. So my editor said, that needs to be sort of 80% Predator, 20% Alien. So I could still write some Alien stuff in there. It's great fun. I had such a big cast of characters and so many people I wanted to kill that I had to go on my Facebook page and say, do you want to be a character in my Alien versus Predator trilogy? And you'll probably get your face ripped off. So the amount of volunteers, I had so many volunteers. So lots of my Facebook followers would probably, friends, whatever, would probably find their name in those books if they look deep enough.
Wow. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So the trilogy is pretty dark, as one would imagine. Did you gain, any insight from working in such a dark future like this?
I think the story lent itself to be pretty dark. It's almost a human extinction story. There's a lot of sort of upbeat moments in it, I guess. A lot of valor, a lot of bravery, and like I said, my mind just goes dark. I don't see how you can write an Alien or Predator novel without it being dark. You wouldn't want to do a similar thing to the Star Wars Christmas special with aliens and predators. It just wouldn't work. It's going to be dark and grim, and there's going to be lots of fighting and death and chest bursting, and it's all great. I love it. Such good fun to write, especially when I was killing characters. It was brilliant. Characters with names of my friends.
Oh, I just killed you, by the way.
Yeah.
So what did you have more fun writing for? You said there about how you kind of had to split each book and then have the one together and like your percentages. But what did you prefer, the Xenomorphs or the Yautja? And I'm going to say, I looked online and like there's this whole controversy about how people say this.
I know, yeah.
Do you have a particular way that you say it? But I guess when you're writing, you don't have to think about how people are going to pronounce it.
Yeah, probably how you did there, Yautja, I think.
Yautja.
I just took that name because calling them the Predator doesn't sound right, because they wouldn't call themselves a predator. And I love writing the Xenomorphs more because even though in this trilogy they're sort of, they're finally weaponized and they're given, there's a level of control over them by a certain group of humans and they're used as weapons. But I love, even from the first film, they're just almost a new monster was created in that first film. Really, it's just almost mindless and almost unbeatable, and it's like, it's genuinely like the picture was Jaws in space. It's like all it does is swim, eat, and make little sharks. That's all the aliens do. They don't even see them eating as such, do you? See them biting but not eating. Yeah, so I love writing them. And the first novel, Alien Out of the Shadows, was probably my favorite experience of writing them because it was my first. And like I said, it was a Ripley story as well. And I just love, she's one of my favorite characters in movies or fiction. And I just love writing it. Great.
So family seems to be a recurring theme in your stories. The Voidlarks, the Excursionists, the United States Colonel Marines branch in the Rage trilogy, they were like a close-knit family. So what inspired you to go that route with the Marines?
Well, family is a big theme in all my writing since I had kids, which terrifyingly was 23 years ago. My daughter she's 23 this year. That's horrifying. And my boy's 18 last week, so they're now both adults, which just bemuses me. So people sometimes ask me what your greatest fear is. My greatest fear is threat to my family, and there's nothing more terrifying than that. So that always finds its way into my fiction. So for a group of Marines on a faster than light spaceship. You have to try and build them as a sort of family unit, so that when something happens to one of them, you can try and get over the grief that the others suffer and how close knit they are. And the fact they're on these spaceships for years at a time and they're traveling light years, so they're leaving other family behind who will age differently and things like that. I tried to, the science obviously isn't real in the books, but I tried to make it vaguely feasible, some of it. Many scientists listening would disagree, but there's I did a little bit of research about faster than light travel and time jumps and things like that. It's just if you don't create family units in a book, that in a story that's sprawling, then you don't really feel any loss when characters start to die, which most of them do. Unfortunately, I don't leave many alive.
So you mentioned Star Wars. So you wrote Star Wars Into the Void. How did you initially get involved with that?
The editor asked me to write it. It was the same editor who I'd written which novel? I'm pretty sure I'd written 2 Hellboy novels, and one of them, I'm pretty sure she was the editor on the first one I wrote. So yeah, it was a great day. I remember a phone call from my agent. He phoned me and said, "Oh, we just closed this deal on something." He said, "By the way, do you want to write Star Wars?" And so yes, instantly I said yes. He said, "Right, I'll send the details." And he just had a request from the editor to ask me to write this novel. And they chose me because, she chose me because it's sort of Star Wars is all sort of fantasy as opposed to science fiction in my head anyway, really. But my novel was more sort of sword and sorcery in space, because they're using force swords. They aren't actual lightsabers. They're, slightly different weapons. And the whole idea of the force is slightly different in my novel, in The Dawn of the Jedi. It's a balance, which is more realistic, I think. The force in the films that we're familiar with, you're either light or dark, you're good or bad. But in mine, you need to, in Dawn of the Jedi, I shouldn't say mine, Dawn of the Jedi is a whole comic series, and you need to find the balance in the force. So the balance between the light side and the dark side. And you need to balance yourself. And if you're out of balance, you're in danger of slipping towards the light or the dark.
And I think you picked up on this earlier on in the interview, but how much freedom did you have with that story?
A little less than Firefly. So I seem to remember, I had a chat with the comic writers who were doing that series, and I came up with a few ideas. After reading the comics, I came up with a few ideas, and sometimes it was places, sometimes it was planets or characters that I'd quite like to explore. And every time that happened, they sort of said to me, "Oh no, you can't destroy that planet. We've got a use for it in the future, or you can't go there. We're going to explore that." So I sort of just came up with all my own idea, really, my own characters, my own planets, my own story that was set in the same star system, Tython star system. This is pre-light travel as well, so it's quite contained. It's a bit sort of Firefly-y in a way, in that it's contained as a star and planets and moons, and sub-light travel. So I came up with my own idea, and it does, because it's set in the same universe, and a few of the characters from the comics appear in my novel, but my main character, Lenori Brock. Lenori is an anagram of Eleanor, my daughter. So she is my own creation completely. And I love her. She's fantastic. She's so kick-ass. And she's one of the first Jedi, or Jedi, as they were called back then, apparently. And I love her. She's brilliant. I was hoping to continue her into a trilogy, but that, like I said earlier, that wasn't to be. But people seem to really like her, which was nice.
So moving on from all of that, your non-fiction book, Run, Walk, Crawl, documents your adventures at trying to get fit in, as you say, your 5th decade. So what made you want to write about your trials in getting fit at this stage in your life? Well,
so at the beginning of my 40s, I wasn't fit. I was a couple of stone heavier than I am now. And I'd always done a little bit of exercise here and there. Nothing major. I'd jump on the bike and do 4 miles and think, that's my exercise for the month. Great. And then something turned when I was 41, and I realized I had to turn things around. So I trained for the Three Peaks Challenge with a few mates of mine. Did that, and it all just went a bit extreme. And now I do Ironman races and marathons and ultra marathons and stupidly long bike rides. And it's changed my life completely. Finishing my first Ironman race, which is a ridiculously extreme triathlon. So I wanted to write about it because back in like 8 years ago, I was writing a blog called Run, Walk, Crawl, and I was blogging about my experiences, my races, kit I was buying, new bike delivery tomorrow, actually, which is an exciting day. So I just thought it was I started toying with the idea of just writing it as a fun sort of memoir of my sporting attempts. And then during lockdown, I just, sat around the house trying to work with the whole family here. It became an easier thing to write because I didn't have to worry about plot and the character's me. So, and I just really enjoyed remembering some of the races I'd done and talking about how I did it and why and the results and cake, because I really love eating cake. And it's the main reason I do ultra marathons, because there's always cake at the feed stations. It's always good. I just had great fun doing it. And I thought about a few years ago, my UK agent had shopped the idea around to a few publishers and didn't get much interest. I thought about doing it again, but then I thought the time is now to publish something like that when people have been locked down. I read somewhere yesterday, the average weight gain during lockdown is 0.5 stone amongst people. I mean, I haven't put any weight on, but I've redistributed massively. Not swimming has meant I've gone from here down to here. I just love writing it and self-publishing it through Amazon was another endurance event in itself, but I'm quite pleased with how it turned out. And people, I'm in a triathlon club, and most of the guys there bought it and read it and loved it because they can relate. A lot of the races I talk about, they've done. And it's a few people I don't sort of know personally. They told me it's inspired them to put the running shoes on, or buy a bike, which is really nice to hear.
And something a little different.
Yeah, well, exactly that. Yeah. My first nonfiction book. It was just fun to write, and I never find writing easy. Like, I'm halfway through a novel now, and it's the worst piece of crap I've ever written in my head. It's probably not, but I never find it really easy writing. I don't know many writers that do, actually. Some do, but not many. Some say, no, it's really hard. But this I found easy because it was just me writing about my hobby, the stuff I love doing, and it was good fun. I'm hoping there'll be another one when I'm at the end of my 6th decade. Running, walking, well, maybe not run, walk, crawl, maybe crawl, keeping fit in my 50s. I don't know.
So you've mentioned that you're working on something at the moment. Can you share with us a little about that? Or maybe whether there's going to be another Firefly story in the future? I'm
not sure about another Firefly. Titan haven't approached me. I don't know about that. So the novel I'm writing at the moment is, like I said, it's in my head, it's a sort of a crime thriller, really quite contained in scope. Just four main characters, but one of them doesn't last past the first chapter. But I have got another novel that I wrote during lockdown. Not sure, I can't quite announce it yet though, because the contract's still being negotiated, but but that'll be out next year. That's called The Last Storm, which will be published next year by a publisher who I'll mention when the contract's signed. It's sort of I had a novel out last year called Eden during lockdown, which is a horrible time to launch a novel, I discovered, because shops aren't open, and I was supposed to go on a signing tour, which didn't happen. And it was just, it did okay, and it was really well received, but it's sort of climate change thriller, that one. But The Last Storm is a climate change horror novel more than a thriller, I guess. So I wrote it during lockdown longhand. So I've got a big pile of notebooks here full of my awful handwriting, which when I had to transcribe, I realized I could hardly read. So that was a challenge in itself. But it was a nice way to write a book during a really weird period, just sitting out. We got a garden cabin. I'd sit out there and with a nice pen and a notebook and a cup of coffee and write. So I'm really pleased with it. I think it's a really good book. I'm I can say that now. I finished it and put it to one side. You know, the book I'm writing now is awful, but I'm sure when I finish it, I'll be happy with it.
That was my last question. Is there anything else that you want to share with us?
Well, we talked about the novel for next year. Yeah. If we'd done this interview next week, I might have been able to tell you just a little bit more, but I'm sort of quite cautious before the contract's, you know, signed and all that. So I'm working on some screen stuff, which again, there's nothing to really announce there, but I've adapted. I've written a pilot based on one of my novels with a American screenwriting friend of mine. That's doing the rounds now. And I've got a couple of other screen projects I'm working on developing very slowly. It's generally really slow screen stuff. Although I had a movie made a few years ago called The Silence, which happened in like 2 years. It was like, they saw the book, they loved it, they optioned it, they wrote the screenplay, they made the film. Unbelievably quick process. Generally, it's more like a 10-year thing. So I'm hoping, really, I'd like to get into more screenwriting because I really enjoy it, and being more sort of cynical, you know, because I do writing for a living, that the money is better screenwriting generally. But I really enjoy it as well. I love adapting my own stuff, and I love coming up with original ideas as well. I'm hoping something will happen with one of those projects in the near future. Fingers crossed. Yeah,
we look forward to it, hopefully. Yeah, so thank you very much for chatting with us. Where can our listeners find out more about you and your works online? Do you have a social media they can follow?
Yeah, so, I got a website, timlebbon.net, which is updated infrequently, but when there's news. And I'm on Facebook and Twitter. I'm also on Instagram, but don't understand it yet. And really, Facebook and Twitter are enough for me. I've got a love-hate relationship with social media. I use it a lot, but I find I use it too much sometimes. So I just sort of feel as a writer, you need to be on there. And it's good to, you know, talk with people who read your books and other stuff. So yeah, so I'm on there most days.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks, Laura. Really enjoyed the chat.
Really nice talking to you, and again, love the display of books.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, did you spot my xenomorph?
I was like, yeah, the first thing I saw was the face hugger, and I'm like, wow.
He's a plush one, and I've got Yoda as well.
I did see Yoda in a hat.
Yeah. Yeah, that's my festival hat.